So if you're here today, you are here to learn about how to start inclusion at a school that doesn't practice inclusion. And why do we feel like I can talk about this? Well, hi, I'm Kayla. Let me tell you about myself. I went to San Francisco State University for undergrad and grad school, and that's where I got my teaching credential to for extensive support needs learners. And I got my master's there, and my whole master's project was about teaching general ed teachers how to support all learners in their classroom. And I have to say, SFSU was really big on inclusive practices, and that really just inspired me to make that a priority. And when I was in grad school, I was also a paraprofessional, and I was a one-on-one aide for a student who is deafblind. And I absolutely loved working with him. The school I was at was also really focused on inclusive practices. So all of our students were in general ed classrooms throughout the day. We were included in anything that happened, any sort of extra activity, clubs, all those things. We were just a part of the community as everyone else was. And so then I became a teacher, and I had my first teaching position, and they were not as inclusive. And it wasn't that they weren't wanting to try, but they had no education on inclusive practices. And the general ed teachers, I was the youngest out of, I mean, there was like, I don't know, 25 teachers. I was the youngest by about 10 years minimum. A lot of the teachers were on their way out. They were getting ready to retire. And they were just like, what is inclusion? What are you talking about? So it was a really big lesson for me to, figure out how to teach people about accommodations and inclusive practices and just how we can work better as a community. So I'll go over a lot of that. Um, and then after four years at that school, I moved to another school because I moved with my family closer to family. And at that school, I learned that they knew what inclusion was, but did not care to do it because it was too hard for them to change their values, apparently. But we will talk about that as well in more detail. And then after that, I was pretty sad that it was so hard to make change at a school. And that's when I left and became an education specialist, where I worked with the deafblind community full time. Um, Wrote some books about how to teach inclusion to children, and like different sort of accommodations and stuff. And then I moved out of California, and now I live in Washington, because, California is pretty expensive on a teacher salary. And love it here, became an inclusion specialist, and now I just educate people on inclusive practices. That was a much longer introduction than I meant it to be, but here we are. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. I will try to keep looking. If you guys want to introduce if I click chat, is that going to mess everything up? Okay. Yes, chat is open. So if anybody wants to introduce themselves, totally do it. I will have some questions for you guys to answer and reflect on as we go. So where we are going to begin with bringing inclusive practices into your school is that you have to understand where your baseline is at your school. Um, Now, this is something that I definitely wish I thought of when I went to my second school. Because my first school, I also was new to teaching. So it was kind of like we were all figuring it out together. At my second school, I was like, I know everything. Let me just show you how to do inclusion the right way. And that was the wrong way to do it. Don't come in as a know-it-all. We want to work together and be collaborative. And to do that, we first have to recognize what our baseline is um, at our school. And that means, understanding what the teachers know, what service providers know, um, what the peers, what the students know, what the parents know, what information do people need to know for inclusion to be successful. So we are going to watch this video. If you guys do not know Dr. Shelley Moore, she is amazing. I have to share my sound. Do I know how to do that? I don't know. Here we go. Sit. Oh my gosh. I thought it was going to be under the mute thing. Is it not under the mute thing? More. Pause recording. No. Share computer sound. Found it, everybody. Okay. So I'm going to click on this video. Hopefully it will work. Also, this video is linked on the slides. So if you want to access it later and show it to your school, Dr. Shelley Moore has a whole YouTube channel with so much good information. Let's see.
With so much division in our politics, Joe Kent is adding fuel to the fire.
Welcome to 5 More Minutes, useful videos in 5 minutes or less that support the teaching and learning of all students. I'm your host, Shelley Moore. Today's topic is the evolution of inclusion. Okay, so you remember the dots? I know. I've shown you these before. But one colleague of mine suggested to me once, he goes, what if we didn't look at these as different concepts that we compare to each other, but instead as an evolution of time? It was totally brilliant. Now we could look at this timeline through the lens of any marginalized population, but to understand this timeline from the inclusion and disability perspective, we have to go back in time a little bit. Many of us know or are connected to someone who experienced institutionalization. It was even recommended to families by doctors. Although British Columbia was the first province in Canada to close down their institutions, there are still individuals living in these conditions across Canada today. The institutionalization movement is an example of exclusion. It separated individuals with disabilities from their families without choice. But the disability rights movement over the past 50 years, with the hard work of some incredible self-advocates and families, and maybe a little help from Geraldo Rivera, pushed communities to shift so that individuals of all abilities were welcomed and living in the same settings as their family and friends. This shift from institutions to communities, this was the start of the inclusive evolution. We have movement, but can we do better? Although many individuals are no longer excluded from their families and communities, they were, and let's be honest, they still are, expected to attend segregated schools or self-contained special education programs that are totally separate from the rest of the school community. And so parents started to ask some very good questions. You see, children with disabilities have siblings without disabilities, and families wanted all their kids to have equitable access to community-based education together. Kids started to be integrated into classrooms with their peers. They're in math together. They're in gym class together. They're eating lunch together. Kids are together. This is better. The shift from segregated to integrated schools and classrooms, this is the next step in the evolution of inclusion. We have movement, but can we do better? Well, this is where things get tricky, because integration, it doesn't take long to realize that just being together, it's not enough. Although in the same classroom, students with disabilities are often just that. They're physically in the classroom. They may sometimes have parallel activities, but mostly it's loosely connected classroom tasks. Now, you don't need me to tell you that just physically sharing space and time is enough to make you feel like you belong in a community. I mean, come on, there are Disney movies made about this. Breathing the same air is not enough. Do you remember the Titans? I do. The evolution from integration to inclusion is now the topic of many conversations in communities and schools around the world. How do we support individuals to be meaningfully included and not just physically integrated? It's not just about where kids go in their day, but why. What is the purpose to the places that they go? It's now school-based teams and staff that are asking questions about how to do this. How can we support purposeful and meaningful placements for kids with disabilities? In inclusive classrooms and schools, students aren't just present, but they have roles and responsibilities in their classrooms, and also meaningfully connecting to their peers. This is inclusion. So there you have it, my friends. A brief history of inclusion in about 5 minutes. If this is interesting to you, though, definitely investigate your local history as well, because every community is in a different place in this journey, and it's so valuable to know where we've come from. The other thing, though, is looking at these visuals as a timeline. It really helped me to shift my own thinking from which bubble am I at or not at, and shift to more about where are we now in our inclusive journey and what's our next step. All of a sudden, the goal of inclusion becomes action-oriented and just feels so much more possible. We may not all be at the same place in the journey, but we can all move forward. We can do better. And so this is the question I'm going to leave you with today. Can we still do better? Do you think there's another evolution in inclusion? What might that be? How can we inch even more forward to make inclusion even better? Thanks, Geraldo!
So this is just a time to reflect on where you feel like your school is at the moment. Do you feel like your school is, still at exclusion or segregation, integration or inclusion? And I felt like this was just such a great way to look at it as a timeline, because it does kind of take steps. Inclusive practices does take time to educate people. We can't just put students who've been segregated into the classroom and then just expect everyone to understand what kind of accommodations or behavior plans or whatever we might have. So I'm going to go over some of the practices. Another thing to also realize is the ableism that is really embedded in a lot of our societies and our mindsets. And this is something that really gets, I feel like we just really need to accept that there is ableism that we just like don't even recognize at times. And so really how we can recognize it and have conversations and then just start doing better. So I want to talk about the 3 different types of ableism. One, we have institutional ableism, and this is when um, places in our community aren't accessible, especially things that are public things. So, for example, like buses, if they're not accessible, that's a problem. Like USPS or parks or libraries. If there are things that are for the community that aren't accessible for the community, that is institutional ableism. Interpersonal ableism is when people are treating other people unkindly because of their disability. So thinking less of someone, treating someone less of because they have a disability. A lot of examples of interpersonal ableism that I don't think people think about a lot is stuff when it's like, oh, you're so cute for a disabled person, which is, again, thinking like a disabled person can't also be cute, because that is ableism, interpersonal ableism. And then that can lead to internalized ableism. And a lot of disabled people growing up, feeling like that they're less than and feeling this kind of this lack of respect from their community, not being able to access things, that really can damage how someone views themselves. And so it is really important that we recognize that and do what we can to really include everybody. This used to link to an article. The person said they were taking a break. I don't know if it's back up yet. So just a heads up, this image did come from a really good article. And then inclusion can be hard and necessary. I can tell you that once inclusive practices are happening and they're going and everybody's on board, it becomes so much. I feel like teachers become better, students become more like empathetic and hardworking and learn more. It's really such better outcomes. But it's definitely hard to get the ball rolling at first because you're having to break down these beliefs and values that are just so embedded in us that are, it's challenging. But we are going to go over all of it. Uh, First, to be able to go over it, we do need to talk about perspectives. So, in the chat, if you can tell me what this picture is, what your perspective of this picture is, and we will go from there. There, okay, a lot of people are saying leaves, melting snow, a cow. Oh my gosh, you guys, do you know about this? It is a cow. Now, is there anybody who still can't see the cow? Because I definitely had to have somebody show me how it was a cow. So it is a black and white photo. Here are the eyes of the cow. Here's the nose. It's like their face is all right here. Can you see my mouse? Okay, yes, okay. So this is the cow's face, and it's like really close to the camera. So this was a picture that they, when I was in this deaf-blind program, a program to learn about deaf blindness, it talked a lot about perspective. There is no leaf, just if there is a leaf, I guess I don't know where it is. Um, but it was a great way to kind of just realize like how you can see something or how like our the way of noticing like what is in front of us and how some people needed help. Some people were able to see it right away. Some people, like how creative are we got that people were seeing leaves and it looks like someone says they saw death, which is, do you mean like the scream guy? I guess that's how, or not the scream guy, the death guy. You know what I mean? Um, but yeah, so it's how differently we all saw that picture, not having the information, and then how different our perspective was once we got some information, but how still some people couldn't access that information and some people needed more help. But we all got to, yes, the Reaper. Thank you. I just want to say I still blame like mom brain on my vocabulary. My kids are 4 and 2, and the vocabulary I used to have has just like steadily decreased, but it's coming back. But sometimes I like cannot think of a word. Um, anyways, that is just a small accommodation I will need. Sometimes I like to try to like find the definition and then have people guess it in the chat. That would also be great. Um, so perspectives. So when we think about perspectives towards inclusion, we have to think about, what are other people's perspectives on, what are the barriers that we see a lot with inclusion, especially with teachers and parents. People are concerned that other students aren't going to be able to learn because we're going to focus so much on this one student with a significant disability. They're worried that I don't know. I mean, I feel like that's a pretty big barrier that people talk about. But how is the classroom going to look? Am I going to have to change my teaching strategies? What kind of conversations do we need to have with teachers? What kind of conversations do we need to have with admin and parents and peers for inclusive practices to be successful? So, I when you are the only one really pushing for inclusion at your school, or you're the first one to start this journey, the best way to do it is to lead by example. You are the person that is going to be the one that people are going to be looking towards when it's like, hey, am I doing this right? I like this happened. How do I do this better? And what's also really important to remember when leading by example is that when there is a mistake of some sort, or if you mess up, or if you say something that people don't agree with, how can you have a conversation that everybody can learn from and grow from and continue to move on? So do you guys have any ideas of how to lead by example, to just throw in the chat? Or how you lead by example now at your school sites, in your house, in the community? changing the language you use when speaking about students, I love that example. Modeling inclusive language, yes. And I usually give a little, I realized I didn't even talk about the type of language that I use. I do disability first with specific communities. I know the autism community and the deaf and deafblind community really appreciate disability first language, where I know groups where like people with Down syndrome or people with cerebral palsy prefer um, person first. The other one was identity first. And language is a great example of like it changes with the person. And it's so easy to ask what they prefer. So thank you for bringing up language because very, very important. Practice what you preach exactly. Make everyone feel welcome. I will talk about how I did that when I was the teacher in a classroom, but definitely a great example. Standalone sped class, but I did an after school program that helped all readers at one point. I love that. I will talk about that too. Removing judgment. Yes, that is such a great thing to do. Advocating for kids to have access to the materials. Yes. Um, we worked, yes, keeping positive mindsets and co-teaching. Volunteer. Oh my gosh, you guys, it's like some of the things I'm about to talk about. So yeah, I mean, you guys pretty much answered this one. Making sure to include yourself is so important. Volunteering for things, communicating with people, co-teaching. Those are all great examples of including yourself in the community. I think a lot of times, especially like special ed teachers or support providers, they don't always get thought of when being included when if it's like a general ed teacher topic, but everybody should be included in those topics. That topic is included. It's a topic for everybody. Using appropriate language. That is such a great way because a lot of people don't use the language that the disabled community wants us to use. And that's a great, great conversation to have. And to show, no judgment. It's not like we're getting mad at each other for having these conversations. These are just conversations to have and to learn from each other. And then pumping everyone up. We gotta, keep it positive and get everybody pumped up to do it. So when I first started talking about this topic, I knew the special ed teacher in me had to come up with an acronym. So I came up with the acronym BEG. And this is how I increased inclusive practices at my school sites. So it was 1, befriend the community, 2, educate the community, and 3, get involved in the community. So befriending the community, this was definitely that first step of building those trusted relationships. At my first school, they basically just started calling me Sunshine Chair. That wasn't a position. I just kind of embraced it because I got in there and like they didn't really, birthdays. I really love birthdays and I really don't like it when I get a card and it just says happy birthday 20 times. It just doesn't, it just feels like an extra work, like an extra thing that all teachers have to do to sign happy birthday. And then it actually doesn't feel very thoughtful or meaningful. So I was always trying to figure out different ways to celebrate each other. And even if it was like a $5 Starbucks gift card, if that was like in a budget that the school had, or if it was like we would order food out that day if your school is able to do that. There were a lot of different ways that every year we kind of changed it up on how we were going to celebrate each other. And some people said they didn't really care to celebrate their birthday. But after a year or two, I feel like more people got invested because it was just fun. And it wasn't like we made them like such a big deal and, made anybody uncomfortable. But it was just something that really started building those trusted relationships, which is so important when, if you're already a segregated classroom to like have people trust you putting your students and aides in other classrooms. Also, this is a link, the Sunshine Binder. I ended up making it into a binder. I sell it on Teachers Pay Teachers, but you get it for free. So click this link and you will get the whole binder for free. It should be the updated version. So yeah, so that, and that will go through, it goes month by month of things that you can do at your school that are just really simple things, and a wide variety of people who want to be like do more hands-on things to people who want to do like not so hands-on things, but you're still getting to know each other. But saying hi and introducing yourself is super important. Having lunch with your coworkers, this was something that I made a huge priority. I would not let myself work during lunch more than like once a week. And even that, I made lunch a huge priority for me to have my 30-minute break or however long it is. Learning something new about your coworkers, that was something that really helped building trusted relationships. Again, I was much younger than a lot of my coworkers, and so they had to basically trust me that I was also like educated and wanting to work with them. And after school hangs, my first school, actually both schools, we had a lot of after school staff hangouts where we would, on Fridays, there was a Mexican restaurant near us that had a happy hour menu that we would go to. And it did not have to revolve around drinking or anything. I meant like happy hour food menu. But I mean, if you want to drink with your coworkers, cool with that too. Whatever bonds y'all together. And then inviting others into your room. This was something that I did very early on my first year teaching, that I told teachers, I'm like, if you're having a student who is not focused on the work and they're just really wanting to, they like need a break, send them over to my room and they can be a part of whatever we are doing. And that was a huge way for teachers to start teachers gaining my trust. No, I don't know. We were building the trusted relationship. But it was just, and it took them a while. I had to keep reminding them if we got to lunch and if someone was complaining about a student just not being able to focus and having a really hard time and distracting others, I would tell them, I'm like, hey, after lunch, just send them to my room. We're going to do some silent reading, and like we all partner up, they can silent read with us, or send them at this time. We're going to do a science project if they want to be a part of it. And then that really started, because even me having them come into my room, it then started switching it to where the students that were going into their room, they started inviting them over randomly throughout the day, which was just like such a great add-on way to like increase inclusive practices. Next step is educating the community. I loved doing ability awareness activities for for the other teachers. And those were great ways to educate the students while also educating the teachers. So I would come in, especially in elementary school, my favorite one to do was these. Oh, well, first I'd ask so it has to go off of what your population is at your school. So my classroom, it was an autism classroom, and the majority of my students were non-speaking. They would use AAC devices or sign language, facial expressions, or whatnot. And so we did an ability awareness where I would ask everyone to turn off their voice, and I would have them ask me or tell me different things. So tell me that you're hungry. And they would, usually hold on to their stomach or like, try to say food to their mouth. And then I'd say like that you're cold. And so they would like, look all cold, huddle next to somebody. And then I'd ask them to tell me that their friend took their ball and they really want it back. And usually kids would look really upset or angry. And there would always be one kid that would pretend to hit someone near them. And so then we would talk about it and be like, okay, so, it was pretty clear how you felt on all three of those things. A lot of my students, they don't use their words to communicate. How can we communicate with them when we are seeing if they're looking frustrated or happy or sad or hungry? And then like, how can we support each other through all those? And that was a great way to get the conversation going on communication with students who might not be speaking, verbally speaking. And then we do a little puzzle activity where we would celebrate our differences. Sometimes I'd bring in a book talking about different things. Um, I actually think this icon, I could be wrong. There might be a link to this book icon that goes to my inclusive library on my website. Um, if someone checks that out. If not, it's on my website. It's on inclusionstartsnow.com. It's totally free, but you can message me. Okay, it works. Great. So I do have that up there too. It's not totally updated because I keep getting more inclusive books now. Um, but I post a lot of it on Instagram. So if you ever need suggestions, find me on there. Okay, someone just said, how do you navigate the differences? I love the idea of celebration of differences. However, a parent shared with me a few years ago, we want everyone to feel included, but we're always harping on how they're different. So I have actually, someone has talked to me about that. I mean, I guess the inverse of that would be celebrating what we have in common. Um, and that is something that I also will talk about when I celebrate differences. I will also talk about things in common too, where it's like, oh, you both like to dance, or you both like Disney, you both like Fortnite, like finding those connections to bring kids together. Cause I mean, that's kind of how adults find friends too, right? We find something in common and then we want to talk about it. And then you start learning more about each other. So that is also a way. Because yeah, I do know that I have heard that people don't want to celebrate differences too much because then we're focusing on how different we are from each other. But I do think it's good to celebrate our differences while also noticing what we have in common. So I hope that helps. Um, and actually, I got that comment last time I talked about school-wide celebration of differences. Now, this is totally based again off your school site. There's so many months where there's like Autism Acceptance Month and World Down Syndrome Day. Um, and if you want to celebrate that at your school, I think that's a great thing to do. If people don't want to and they'd rather celebrate other things, I think that's fine. If you're not going to do a celebration of differences, I do think it's great to have disabled advocates and disabled heroes included in, like when you talk about just important people, historical figures. And there are a lot of disabled people that are, um, there to be talked about. And I know there's like books, like autism artists, like ABCs or something. So if you want more resources on that, I do not have that planned, but I'm happy to talk about that with anyone who wants to. Um, and then again, the educational conversations with coworkers. Sometimes I would bring like an Instagram video to the lunchroom and be like, oh my gosh, did you guys see this? Or I would like send out a YouTube video to people's emails and be like, wow, look at this. Um, to get the ball rolling on conversations. I like that new movie that is coming out to Disney Plus, Out of My Mind. That's like a trailer that you can send to everybody and be like, hey, maybe next year we can have a movie night for like a school-wide movie night. And it could be such a simple way to have the representation and educating people in your community at the same time. And then introduce yourself to the PTA. This is also step of number 3, but me connecting with the PTA made it so much easier to get to make sure that they thought of me during assemblies or during after school activities that they planned. The PTA at my school planned the Halloween party carnival at one of my last schools. And after they met me, that was when they started thinking, that's when they would think to come to me to be like, how can we make sure your kids can access this carnival too? Um, and then me talking to my parents being like, hey, I'm going to be at the carnival. This is what you can expect. If you need these accommodations, they're going to be there. And just having that open dialogue is so important. And then getting involved in the community. So volunteering and chaperoning things. I loved chaperoning school dances when I was a middle school teacher. That also gave my students' parents comfort knowing that I was going to be there. And I would also sometimes have my paras come with me if they wanted to volunteer their time. Sometimes schools can pay for it. My school did not. It's up to you if you want to volunteer your time. I also volunteered going to football games, so my students would come with, and I would try to hang back so they got to hang out with peers, and I wasn't like the creepy old teacher that was sitting there like, "Hey guys, let's all be friends." But, giving them that independence and support, any support that they need to be there. Recess duty, I remember someone asking me if I wanted to have recess duty, and I was like, do other teachers get to opt out of it? And if they don't, then I don't. I was just a part of it as everyone else. Buddy class and groups. Now, I do feel like buddy class is getting a bad rap right now. We I will tell you how I ran. It was just called buddy class is what we called it, but it was definitely not that the general ed students were like teaching the students in my classroom. What it was me and a general ed teacher partnered up. We mixed our classroom equally, like in half. Half of the kids went to her room and half the kids went to my room. Everybody did the same project. It was usually art or like a science. It was something hands-on, and we usually worked in groups, and it was all about just like social interaction, like genuine peer social interaction. And we also made sure that all the aides and teachers were trained not to or like how to have conversations with peers on the spot of like, hey, you're not their teacher, like, you know they're just your peer, like, do you want how do you want to have this conversation? um because that is something I see a lot where they have general ed students come in and then they're acting as mini teachers, which is never how peer support should be. We can all help each other out. And what's so good is when you can recognize when your students from the special ed classroom are working with another student and like they can lead something. It's so important to try to spot those times when it can happen, to really get that peer involvement. Inviting students into my room, we already talked about that. And I know electives, art, PE, those are kind of the first things that we can start at to really start building inclusive practices. They're not as structured. They usually teachers are a little bit more flexible. If that's where you have to start, that's where you have to start. In my middle school, that is pretty much where we had to start. And it ended up continuing to grow from there, but it was again just really building that trust with the staff, and then attending events, which we already talked about. So all of these really led to genuine peer relationships with my students and their peers. And one of my favorite stories that happened, so the buddy class I started, when those students they were third graders. When they were fifth graders and not in my class anymore, they were all still doing very inclusive practices. And it was like the end of the year and they did this kickball game. And it was all the fifth graders went up and played kickball. The special education classroom was just as much a part of it as the two general ed classrooms. And they were playing kickball. And when one of the students with a disability went up to kick the ball, the pitcher automatically was accommodating and came in a little bit closer, rolled the ball a little bit slower, knowing that the student doesn't play kickball as much. And then he kicked the ball and all the students like cheered while he got to first or second base, and the team was kind of helping the student navigate the rules. And then cheered him on. And it was and again, I wasn't even there. I had someone come and tell me this story, and I basically just cried in the lunchroom because it was so nice to know that what the work that we were doing in third grade 2 years later, it was something that all of the students were just like, they didn't bat an eye. Nobody second guessed that everyone like couldn't be a part of the game, that everyone was, it was easily accessible and they were accommodating. No teachers said anything. All the adults just sat there and watched this happen. And so I'm just saying that it can lead to very great, genuine peer relationships. And then this is also mind shifts for educators. When I first got there, most of the teachers were just like, well, how is this going to work? There was fear of the unknown. And so giving them the information, letting them know that they can trust me and that I'm there to help them, really got it going so well. And I mean, the school that I was an elementary school teacher at, I haven't been there in like 5 or 6 years, and they are still doing so many of the things that like was implemented at the beginning. Like we did celebrate Autism Acceptance Month, and they did make sure to celebrate it the way that the autistic community wants us to celebrate it. And they continue to learn about it. And the whole school buys shirts for it. And it's just become a very normal practice at that school, which is just so great. And it really just built a community that wanted inclusion. To see what inclusion is. Yeah, when it's the norm on campus, it just keeps growing. And I feel like everyone just got happier. I mean, who doesn't want to go to work and like enjoy work? We're there so much, you know? Um, okay, so the IEP is also a great place to push in inclusive practices. If you're having a hard time really getting it through to admin and general ed teachers, this is also a way that I got inclusion in at our school. So making sure to add the minutes, changing the goals, and putting them on graduation track. So on IEPs, there's a place where you're supposed to say the percentage of minutes that the students are with the general ed students. And I know the minimum for my schools was recess and lunch. So that was always in the IEP, and that was the minimum amount of minutes. The second my students started going into general ed classrooms, I would up the minutes also on the IEP, which is such a short, send it home, people sign it, put it back in. But it was something that was it was a focus for me. I think it also helped me with the goals that I wanted for my classroom. And it was, an easy thing to add into the IEP. I'm not quite sure why this bullet point is in this page, but we're going to talk about it. Practice bumping and training staff. So when you're increasing minutes, actually, this makes sense now why this is here. Okay, while you're increasing minutes in the general ed classroom, train the staff on how to encourage those genuine peer relationships. So a great way that I love to talk about is called bumping. And this is something I did when I was in a sorority. And it was a really cool sorority, super nonprofit. It was great. Anyways, we would practice bumping. And so what it was is how you would get to meet other people. So you'd be talking to someone and they would be like, "Oh yeah, I just went to Disneyland. Like I go once a month." And I'd be like, "Oh, that's crazy. I have a friend who loves Disneyland and she, watches every movie, like a Disney movie, probably once a week. Let me introduce you." And that is bumping. How I did it with my students. I had a student who knew all the Fortnite dances. I don't know if that's like when you do something good, but he would do the dances all the time. He absolutely loved them. So if I ever heard a student talking about Fortnite, playing Fortnite, I would be like, "Oh my gosh, my student Max loves Fortnite. He knows all the dances. Do you know all the dances?" And then, I'd put them together and they'd start talking about it. And then usually I'd start to fade myself out. And so this is something that you can train your staff to do, because it's important that we're always trying to push our students for independence. And so if a staff is like constantly on them, it's going to make it harder for, general ed students, the general ed students to be able to connect with that student if there's like an adult towering over them all the time. So learning when you can start backing up and when you need to jump in if there's going to be an issue. And then recess and lunch. This is a time that I felt like a lot of staff felt like it was their break. And it's important to talk about that with your staff, to know that recess and lunch is a huge time where peers are playing and making memories and getting to know each other. Everybody loves recess. I shouldn't say everybody, but a lot of kids love recess. So making sure that the staff that is out at lunch and recess, that they don't have their phones, that they're trained to probably try to bump students together or try to encourage some play together. Like, "Oh, are you trying to throw a ball? Like, let's throw a ball with these kids." And then eating lunch with peers. This is an example of those bubbles that we talked about at the beginning, where having a table for the special ed classroom that is at the back of the lunchroom is not inclusion. That is an example of integration, and having the students sitting with their peers, like their grade level peers, is such a better practice, inclusive practice. And again, that's a time where a lot of memories are being made, conversations are happening, fun is happening. So figuring out how to successfully do that. When I was a para, um, we had a classroom of 9 students. This was an extensive support needs classroom, and there were 5 paras. And so all of us were split, and all the students were split, and all the students sat with the classrooms that they went in and out of throughout the day. And I'm not going to lie, when it first started, it was pretty hard because it was new. The students were all sitting in new places. We had adaptive seats in new places. And then the excitement, it was exciting, and it did take some time. But again, this is that example of like, it's hard, but it's also necessary. That it was hard at the beginning, but within like a month, it was getting good. And the students didn't require so much help or support. They understood where they were going. The peers understood what was like, everyone understood what was happening. And it was just great. So those are good practices to do for recess and lunch. Changing goals. So IEP goals, you have to put accommodations in IEP goals anyways. How about we add that it's going to be in a peer group setting? So now you can't track data unless our students are in peer groups. That was one of my favorite ways to sneak that in there. Having social goals is also a way to, if your student's about to leave your classroom and you're worried that the next teacher is not going to be focusing on having conversations with students outside of the special ed classroom, add a social goal, add those goals that have to be worked on, and to just encourage more inclusive practices. Thank you. Work with therapists for push and support. Now, I know this is also a little sticky one. But why don't we do more push and support? If there is speech, why is speech being done in a room alone? I know that sometimes the goals might not feel appropriate for that grade level, but then how can we make it appropriate? What is that next step that we can, like, how can we get that creative step? Like, how can we read a story with a group of students and then maybe every once in a while ask the student that you're tracking data on to like point to a certain letter? I mean, they can very much be included in the general ed classroom and still have their academic goals. That can all blend together nicely. And then putting them on graduation track. Now, when I was my first year teaching, it was first, second, and third graders. And there was a little checkbox with my IEPs on if they were on the graduation track. I know California just got their new graduation. I can't remember what it's called. So, but that's something, transition just gets not thought about very often. But thinking at the very beginning that you want the student to learn how to, grow their independence. You want them to be on graduation track or be on God, what is it called? Accommodated? Ugh, I cannot, I
So
can't believe
alternate pathways.
alternate. Yes, thank you. The alternate pathway. Do you want that? Like, why don't we just make that the goal now? And if it has to change, it has to change. But if we put that in now, I feel like it shifts the mindsets of people thinking like, okay, alternate pathway to diploma. How are we going to make that happen? Which is so great. So we're going to just do a quick little practice. Here's an IEP goal I found via Google. By May 2024, we will add the accommodation here. Max will read grade level text orally with accuracy, appropriate rate, and expression with 90% accuracy as measured by teacher records on 3 consecutive occasions. What is a super simple inclusive accommodation that we can put there? Beautiful. That is exactly what I put too, Donovan. When in reading groups with peers. That is all you have to do. And then it will become a focus and we'll have to keep getting better at it. And I mean, really don't feel discouraged if at first it's hard and it's not working. Because I mean, practice makes permanent, and we have to give it time. We have to let kids adjust, and we have to communicate with them, try to figure out what their needs are. It's always a work in progress. And I think another just like important mindset for all of us in the field of like pushing it or increasing inclusive practices is that there's no completion. Like there's inclusion's not ever done. There's always going to be more we can do. There's always going to be more students coming in and new teachers coming in. And we will always be adapting to what's happening socially. And so, um, knowing that there's not this end goal and that it's just a beautiful journey that we all are going to be learning from, I think really helps maybe taking the pressure off, I guess, is how I view it. Don't think about getting to the end. Just think about, what's the next step and how are we going to celebrate that? Um, so in summary, uh, leading by example is so important. Building those trusted relationships with your community, making it legal. One of my favorites, just throwing it in that IEP. Um, and focusing on playtime. That's such a great way to build those peer relationships. And then just keep educating people, um, giving them the resources they need. There are so many great books out there about inclusion. I know one of my personal ways I bring inclusive conversations into my friend groups is in my book clubs, I will pick books that have disability representation and talk about it because that is the only way that people can even learn like about something they might not know anything about. Um, okay, well, I totally started going faster at the end because I thought I was going to be running out of time. So questions would be great. How did you bring inclusive conversations into the lunchroom? So that it changed based off of the age group for sure. Because in elementary school, it was way more, I mean, like the students also really enjoyed talking to the adults at the table. So a lot of the students would be asking me questions about my students that were there. And so I would answer them as simply as I could. If my student could answer them, I would maybe, because a lot of my students would say like yes, no, they would answer yes, no questions. And that was just a great way to, if they were like, oh, why are they eating with a G tube? And I'm like, oh, well, that's how they drink their water. They have their G tube, but they also really like um, mac and cheese. Like, right? Do you like mac and cheese or do you like mac and cheese or this? Or I'd have their AAC device, whatever kind of conversation I could put on my student to also be a part of that. In middle school and high school, it's a little bit trickier because like they don't want the adults around, especially teachers. I feel like paras kind of get to be the cool adults that are there. Because some of the paras that were in my classroom at that time, they were really good at talking to the students. And so they would kind of, like a student would ask a question and they might answer it and then be like, oh, actually, and again, it was a lot of bumping of like finding out any sort of similarity, and then like kind of putting them together. And also like paras and the adults are the ones that are going to be educating the kids on how to communicate with our students, especially if they're communicating differently. If they use like facial expressions or their AAC devices or, whatever they use. Um, but from what I've been noticing, I feel like a lot of students are interested in that. And that's not like a way to, like that, it's a way, sometimes it's like a topic, a conversation that they want to be involved in. Also, I did forget, there is the QR code is back up again. Um, all of those little images below Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, a lot of my resources and information is there. So if you want to go to any of those and learn more, about just like stuff that I do out in the field. That is it.